The cold November wind made the trees groan and bend as if whispering ominous warnings. Dry leaves crunched under the boots of Officer James Turner as he advanced along the narrow trail. Beside him, Emma Carter scanned the dense woods, her breath quickening with tension. The call they had received described a chilling scene. A dog, tied up deep in the forest. "You need to get here fast." There was something unsettling about the voice on the phone. It wasn't just urgency, it was fear. James couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a routine call. Minutes passed, and the silence around them grew oppressive. Then, without warning, a bark echoed through the trees, sharp and strained. They both froze. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered. James nodded, lifting his flashlight and sweeping the beam across the path ahead. The bark came again, louder this time, guiding them deeper into the woods. Soon they saw it, a shape barely visible through the tangled underbrush. As they approached, their eyes widened in shock. A large dog was tied tightly to a tree, his thin body trembling from exhaustion and cold. The dog's eyes locked onto theirs, filled with a mix of desperation and resilience. There was a strange, watchful intelligence behind his gaze. Who would do something like this? Emma muttered under her breath, horrified. James knelt cautiously beside the dog and began working on the thick ropes constricting its body. Despite his obvious suffering, the animal didn't resist. He stood still, his dark eyes never leaving James, as if he had seen worse and learned to endure. "Easy, buddy. It's okay now. You're safe," James murmured as he loosened the final knot. The dog staggered slightly as he was freed, but he quickly steadied himself. That's when Emma noticed something around the animal's neck. An old, worn leather collar. Faint letters were etched into the cracked surface. Kaiser. She traced the name with her fingers, feeling an inexplicable chill run down her spine. "Kaiser," she repeated softly, the name resonating with a strange familiarity. James furrowed his brow as if trying to recall something buried deep in his memory. With Kaiser now walking silently beside them, the officers made their way back through the forest. The dog showed no fear, no aggression, and no intention to flee. Instead, he moved with quiet purpose, as if he trusted them. James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an ordinary dog. His discipline, his composure, and the way he watched every move they made hinted at a past of intense training, perhaps even military. But who had abandoned him like this? And why? The uneasy feeling in James' gut grew stronger with each step. That cold, eerie night was only the beginning of something much larger than either of them could have imagined. Back at the station, the quiet buzz of fluorescent lights filled the air. Kaiser lay silently on a blanket Emma had laid out for him, his eyes scanning the room with calculated precision. Despite his calm demeanor, there was a tension in his posture, as if he were always on alert. James watched him from across the room, deep in thought. "There's no way this dog ended up like that by accident," he muttered to himself. Every instinct told him there was more to this story. Emma returned from the station's kitchen, carrying a bowl of water and a plate with some leftover chicken. She knelt down in front of Kaiser, who cautiously sniffed the food before eating with controlled bites. "He doesn't act like a stray," she remarked. "He's disciplined, almost like he's waiting for orders." James nodded, his mind racing through possibilities. Was Kaiser a former police dog? A military K-9? If so, why would someone abandon a dog like that in the middle of nowhere? The mystery deepened as Emma began searching through online databases for missing dogs. After nearly an hour, she paused. "Hey, take a look at this," she called out. James walked over, his brow furrowing as he read the report on the screen. It was from 3 years ago. A police K-9 named Kaiser reported missing during a high-profile operation in a neighboring county. The file stated that the dog had disappeared under suspicious circumstances and was presumed dead after a prolonged search yielded no results. 3 years. And now he turns up tied to a tree, James said, shaking his head. The pieces didn't add up. How does a trained police dog vanish for that long and reappear like this? Emma leaned back in her chair, clearly troubled. And if it's him? Why would someone go through the trouble of restraining him like that instead of just letting him go? The questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The station's atmosphere seemed colder as both officers pondered the implications. As the clock neared midnight, a sudden noise broke the silence. A faint scratching sound from the door leading to the station's entrance. Kaiser's ears perked up instantly, his body stiffening like a coiled spring. Emma and James exchanged wary glances before James moved to investigate. Kaiser followed closely, his steps silent and deliberate. When James opened the door, there was no one there. Only the wind howled through the empty street outside. But something was off. Kaiser stood at the threshold, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. His posture spoke volumes. Danger was near. James scanned the empty street, the cold night air stinging his face. The town was silent, save for the faint rustling of tree branches swaying in the wind. Yet something didn't feel right. Kaiser remained frozen at the doorway, his eyes locked on the shadows at the edge of the street. The dog's rigid stance and low growl sent a chill through James. "You see something, buddy?" James whispered, his hand instinctively resting on the flashlight clipped to his belt. Emma stepped up beside them, her gaze shifting between Kaiser and the darkness. "What is it? You think someone's out there?" she asked softly. Before James could answer, Kaiser took a step forward, his senses on high alert. James followed, shining his flashlight across the street and down the deserted block. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement, a faint silhouette slipping between two buildings. He tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Stay here," he ordered Emma, who opened her mouth to protest but thought better of it. James and Kaiser crossed the street, their steps muffled by the wind. The dog moved like a shadow, silent and controlled. They approached the narrow alley where James had seen the figure, the beam of light illuminating empty trash bins and a cracked brick wall. "Hello? Police?" James called out, his voice echoing off the walls. No response. Kaiser moved ahead, nose to the ground, sniffing with urgency. Suddenly, he stopped and let out a sharp bark, startling James. The dog was staring at something on the ground, a torn scrap of fabric caught on a jagged piece of metal. James crouched to inspect the cloth. It was dark, stained with mud, but looked relatively fresh. "Someone was here," he muttered. He stuffed the fabric into a plastic evidence bag and straightened up, his eyes narrowing. Whoever had been watching them had left in a hurry. But why? What were they after? As he pondered the questions, Kaiser began pacing, his behavior increasingly tense. It was clear that the dog sensed something James couldn't. Back at the station, Emma was waiting anxiously by the door. "Did you find anything?" she asked as they returned. "Just this," James replied, holding up the evidence bag. "But someone was definitely out there." Emma frowned, glancing at Kaiser, who continued to pace restlessly inside the station. "This isn't a coincidence, James. First we find Kaiser tied up, and now someone's lurking around the station. You think it's connected?" James exhaled heavily. "I don't believe in coincidences," he said grimly. "Whoever that was, they know something about Kaiser, and I'm starting to think we're in the middle of something bigger than we realize." The next morning, James arrived at the station early, still haunted by the events of the previous night. The fabric scrap he had found lay on his desk, now dried but still muddy. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, someone who knew more about Kaiser than they did. As he stared at the evidence, Kaiser lay nearby, ears perked and eyes observant. It was as if the dog knew the investigation wasn't over. Emma soon walked in, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Rough night?" she asked, handing him one. "Couldn't sleep," James replied, taking a sip. "I keep thinking about that person we saw. They didn't want to be caught, but they weren't just some random vagrant. They were after something, or someone." Emma nodded thoughtfully, and Kaiser's reaction was telling. He knew something was off before we did. She glanced over at the dog, who was now sitting upright, watching their every move. It was almost eerie how attuned he was to the situation. "We need more information," she continued. "Let's start by contacting the precinct where Kaiser was reported missing." A few hours later, they were on the phone with Detective Laura Simmons, who had worked the case years ago. "Kaiser," Simmons repeated, her voice cautious. "You're saying you found him alive?" Emma explained the circumstances of the discovery, including the condition in which they had found the dog. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Simmons finally spoke again. "That dog disappeared during one of our most dangerous operations. There were rumors, people saying he had been taken, maybe even used by criminal organizations. But we never had proof." James exchanged a glance with Emma, the pieces slowly starting to fall into place. "Taken by who?" he asked. Simmons sighed. "We suspected a trafficking ring that we were investigating at the time. They were known for unconventional tactics. But like I said, it was all speculation. If Kaiser really is alive, someone might not want you digging into this." The detective's warning hung in the air like a storm cloud. James clenched his jaw. He knew now that finding Kaiser hadn't been a coincidence. As they ended the call, Emma leaned back in her chair, processing the new information. So Kaiser might have been stolen and trained for something else? If that's true, there could still be people out there looking for him. James nodded gravely. "And we just put ourselves on their radar." Kaiser, sensing the tension, stood and moved closer to James. His eyes locked on the officer as if to say, "I'm ready." "We need to be careful," James muttered. "This isn't just about a missing dog anymore. We've stepped into something dangerous. And whoever's behind this isn't finished yet." Later that evening, James and Emma decided to drive Kaiser to the outskirts of town for some air and to clear their heads. The station had become tense, as if invisible eyes were watching every corner. The woods stretched along a long, quiet road, and the fading sunlight cast eerie shadows over the landscape. Kaiser sat calmly in the back seat of the patrol car, though his eyes were ever vigilant. The tension from the previous night still lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. "We'll take him for a short walk. Let him stretch his legs," James said, glancing at Emma. "It might help him, and us, to relax." As they walked along the edge of the forest, the cool wind rustled the treetops. Kaiser moved with purpose, sniffing the ground and pausing periodically to listen to the faintest of sounds. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Emma seemed to sense it too, her hand resting near the radio on her belt. "You notice how quiet it is?" she asked, her voice low. James nodded. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnervingly still. No distant animal calls, no rustling of small creatures. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath. Kaiser suddenly froze. His ears perked high, and a low, rumbling growl emerged from his throat. Both officers stopped in their tracks. James followed the dog's gaze, aiming his flashlight toward the dense trees. The beam caught glimpses of shifting shadows, too far to distinguish clearly. "Who's out there?" James called out, his voice cutting through the silence. No response. The flashlight beam danced across tree trunks and underbrush, but nothing moved. Still, Kaiser didn't relax. His growl deepened, and the hair on his back stood on end. Emma drew her flashlight as well, scanning the opposite side of the road. "James, I don't like this," she murmured. "We're not alone." Just then, there was a distant but unmistakable sound. A snapping twig. James's instincts flared. "All right, back to the car," he ordered firmly. Kaiser hesitated, his body rigid, before finally following. The three of them retreated carefully, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Each step they took back toward the vehicle felt heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to pull them deeper into its shadows. Reaching the car, James and Emma quickly secured Kaiser inside before getting in themselves. As soon as the engine roared to life, James backed the car onto the road, eyes darting to the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the headlights. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Emma shook her head, but her expression was grim. "Let's get back to the station," she said quietly. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the drive, but both knew one thing for certain. Someone was out there, and they were watching. Back at the station, the sense of unease only deepened. James parked the car and glanced at the station entrance, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Nothing. Emma opened the back door, letting Kaiser out, and the dog immediately began pacing near the building's entrance, his eyes never settling. He's still on edge, Emma observed. Whatever was out there, it hasn't left his mind. James nodded grimly. It hasn't left mine either. Inside, the station was eerily quiet. Most of the officers had gone home for the night, leaving only the two of them on duty. James headed to his desk and began typing up a report on the night's events. But his thoughts kept drifting. That figure in the woods. Was it real? Or had his mind played tricks on him? As he typed, Emma entered the room carrying a file. I did some digging, she said, placing it on his desk. It's about the trafficking ring Detective Simmons mentioned. There's a lot here, illegal arms, narcotics, but there's something strange. They were reportedly using dogs for smuggling operations. James flipped through the pages, his eyes narrowing. One section described how the criminals had trained dogs to carry contraband across borders. Some dogs were stolen, others were bought from shady breeders. The mention of a missing K9 unit caught his attention. They really took police dogs? He asked, incredulous. Emma nodded. Yeah, and apparently some of them were never found. The pieces were starting to fit, and James didn't like the picture they were forming. Before either of them could continue, the station's security alarm suddenly blared, shattering the silence. Kaiser barked loudly, running toward the main entrance. Emma and James exchanged alarmed glances and rushed after him. Outside, the station's security cameras showed static, as if someone had tampered with them. James unlocked the door and cautiously stepped outside, his hand on his service weapon. The street was empty, but an unsettling feeling crept over him. Emma checked the perimeter while James scanned the area, his pulse quickening. Whoever was out there, they're not done with us, he muttered. As Emma rounded the corner of the building, she called out, James, over here. He ran to her and found a piece of paper taped to a lamppost near the entrance. The message was hastily scrawled in large, uneven letters. Leave the dog where you found him. The paper was damp from the night air, but the warning was clear. James felt a surge of anger and fear. Someone was trying to intimidate them. He tore the note down and looked at Emma, who shook her head in disbelief. They're watching us, James. This is serious. James's jaw tightened. We're not backing down. Kaiser's safer with us than out there. Whoever's behind this. They just made it personal. James stared at the warning note in his hands, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't an idle threat. Whoever had left the message was bold enough to tamper with the station's security system. That meant they weren't dealing with amateurs. We need to secure the station, James said firmly. Lock down the perimeter and check all entrances. We're not giving these people an easy target. Emma nodded and immediately set to work, checking doors, windows, and the surveillance equipment. Kaiser remained by James's side, his body tense and his gaze never resting. Inside the station, the atmosphere was suffocating. The alarm had been reset, but the silence that followed felt even more ominous. James checked the security footage, but the screens only showed static at the times when the cameras had gone offline. Whoever had done this knew exactly how to avoid being seen. They're professionals, Emma muttered as she re-entered the room. We're not dealing with someone who's just following orders. These people know what they're doing. James agreed. And they're watching every move we make. While reviewing the footage frame by frame, something finally caught James's attention. At the edge of one frame, just before the cameras went dark, he spotted a faint figure moving near the back entrance. It was blurry, but clearly someone in a hooded jacket. James paused the video and zoomed in. Though the face was obscured, there was something familiar about the posture. Emma, take a look at this, he said, pointing to the screen. Emma leaned in, narrowing her eyes. Could that be one of the traffickers Simmons mentioned? They might have been tracking Kaiser since the day he disappeared. The thought sent a shiver down James's spine. If that's true, they probably didn't expect us to find him, he said slowly. But now that we have, they want to make sure we stay out of their business. Emma crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. So what do we do? Call in backup? Simmons said this operation was dangerous. We might be out of our depth here. James shook his head. If we bring in more people, we risk Kaiser being taken again. We need to stay low and gather more information first. No one can know where he is until we figure out what's really going on. A loud bang from outside interrupted their conversation, followed by Kaiser barking fiercely. James and Emma ran to the station's entrance, weapons drawn. Kaiser was already at the door, growling with intensity. Another noise echoed from the alley beside the building. Footsteps, hurried and clumsy. They're trying to rattle us, James muttered. He opened the door slowly, stepping outside with Emma close behind. The alley was empty, but something glittered on the ground beneath the streetlight. A small metal object. James bent down to pick it up. A key, rusted and bent, with the initials DR engraved on it. They're leaving us clues, he whispered. Emma frowned, looking around. Or leading us into a trap. James turned the rusted key over in his hand. The initials DR staring back at him under the dim streetlight. Emma knelt beside him, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. DR? Any idea what that stands for? She asked. James shook his head slowly, his mind racing through possibilities. It could be a location, a person, or something tied to the old investigation. Either way, they wanted us to find it, he replied. Kaiser remained alert, his ears twitching at the faintest sounds around them. The tension in the air was electric, and James could feel that whoever was toying with them wasn't far away. Back inside the station, James and Emma sat in front of the computer, searching for any connection to the initials. Emma eventually found something: DR storage facility, an abandoned warehouse complex on the outskirts of town, previously used by a transport company that had gone bankrupt years earlier. James leaned forward, reading the report carefully. The warehouse had been investigated briefly during the operation where Kaiser had gone missing. No evidence had been found back then, but now it seemed too coincidental. This has to be it, James said, his voice low. It's where they want us to go. Emma crossed her arms and gave him a hard look. You're not thinking of going there alone, are you? James glanced at her, knowing what she was thinking. We don't have much of a choice. If we call for backup, they might scatter before we get close. This might be our only chance to catch them off guard. Emma sighed and nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I'm coming with you. If this place is tied to Kaiser's disappearance, it's not just about finding answers. It's about making sure they don't get their hands on him again. James agreed. We move fast, in and out. No risks. By midnight, the two officers were driving toward the storage facility, the patrol car's headlights cutting through the fog that had settled over the deserted roads. Kaiser lay in the back seat, occasionally lifting his head to peer out the window. As they approached the complex, the eerie silence returned, much like in the forest the night before. The warehouse loomed ahead, a series of crumbling buildings surrounded by rusting fences. This place looks like something out of a horror movie, Emma muttered, gripping her flashlight tightly. James parked the car a few yards away from the entrance and shut off the engine. Stay alert, he warned. They moved cautiously through the gates, flashlights sweeping across graffiti-covered walls and stacks of decaying crates. Kaiser led the way, his senses heightened. Suddenly, he stopped and growled, his eyes fixed on one of the larger buildings. Emma tensed, whispering, "You think they're inside?" James nodded. Only one way to find out. Slowly, they approached the building's entrance. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed it back and forth. James exchanged a glance with Emma, then drew his weapon. "This is it," he said quietly. "Whatever we're about to find in there. It's been waiting for us." The warehouse interior was suffocatingly dark and eerily quiet, with the faint sound of dripping water echoing in the distance. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the narrow beams of their flashlights. James and Emma moved slowly, their footsteps muffled on the cracked concrete floor. Kaiser led the way, his growls low and steady, his body tense like a coiled spring. "This place is massive," Emma whispered. her eyes darting to the rows of rusted storage units and crumbling walls. They could be hiding anywhere. James scanned their surroundings, hyper-aware of every sound. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, like they were being watched. "Keep your guard up," he muttered. As they advanced further into the building, a sudden noise shattered the silence. A loud clang, as if something metal had been dropped. Both officers froze. Kaiser's ears shot up, and he barked sharply, pulling ahead toward the source of the noise. "Wait!" James whispered harshly, but the dog was already moving, his instincts driving him forward. They followed quickly, turning a corner into a narrow corridor lined with old steel doors. The clanging sound echoed again, this time louder and closer. Emma raised her flashlight, illuminating the far end of the corridor. A shadow moved, slipping behind one of the doors. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. James nodded. "Someone's leading us deeper inside. It's a trap." They pressed forward cautiously, with Kaiser sniffing the ground and stopping at one particular door. The dog growled again, more fiercely this time. James tested the handle. It was locked. "Stand back," he said, motioning for Emma and Kaiser to step aside. With a swift kick, he forced the door open. The room beyond was cluttered with old equipment and crates, but what immediately drew their attention was a single spotlight aimed at the center of the space. Beneath the light lay a folded tarp, and underneath it, something James wasn't prepared for. Slowly, he pulled back the edge of the tarp to reveal a collection of items. Another rusted key, this one marked with K9 Ops, and several photographs of Kaiser during his police training. Emma gasped. They've been watching him all along, tracking him since the day he disappeared. James's hands tightened into fists. "They're playing games with us." Before they could process the discovery, a loud, mechanical click echoed from somewhere above them. The sound of a heavy metal door slamming shut reverberated through the building. "We need to move now," James shouted, his instincts flaring. Kaiser barked urgently, leading them back toward the corridor, but another door ahead slammed shut, trapping them in the maze-like structure. The lights flickered ominously, and the temperature seemed to drop. "They're closing us in," Emma said through gritted teeth. James looked around desperately. "There's gotta be another way out. We just need to stay ahead of them." Kaiser barked again, his senses locked on something neither of them could see. James's pulse pounded in his ears as the flickering lights dimmed almost entirely, leaving the corridor bathed in shadow. Kaiser's growls echoed in the confined space, his body positioned protectively in front of the officers. "They're trying to corner us," Emma said, her voice tight with fear. James gritted his teeth. "We're not going to let them. Follow Kaiser. He'll get us out of here." The dog sniffed the air, his senses on high alert, before bolting toward a side corridor. Without hesitation, James and Emma followed, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the dark. As they ran, muffled footsteps echoed behind them, fast and methodical. Whoever was chasing them wasn't far behind. Kaiser suddenly stopped at a rusted emergency exit, barking and scratching at the door. "This has to be it," James yelled, gripping the handle and pulling with all his strength. The door groaned but didn't budge. Emma joined him, pushing her shoulder against the frame. "It's jammed," she gasped, her breath ragged. From behind them, a voice rang out, cold and taunting. "You can't run forever." Emma's eyes widened as the footsteps drew closer. With a surge of adrenaline, James kicked the door repeatedly until the frame finally gave way, sending them stumbling into an open courtyard behind the warehouse. Kaiser bolted ahead, barking as if warning them of unseen dangers. The moonlight revealed an overgrown lot filled with old shipping containers and broken-down vehicles. "We need to find cover," Emma said, scanning the area. They crouched behind a rusted container as the footsteps echoed out of the building. Several figures emerged, silhouetted by flashlights. "Spread out," one of them barked. The search party was closing in. Emma's hand trembled as she radioed for backup. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. We need immediate assistance at DR storage facility. Armed suspects on site." Static crackled in response, followed by a distorted voice confirming the call. James exhaled in relief but knew they were far from safe. The figures advanced methodically, their flashlights sweeping the lot. One beam landed near their hiding spot, and Kaiser growled softly. "They're getting too close," James whispered. He glanced at Emma. "We can't wait here. We need to distract them and create an opening." Emma nodded, gripping her flashlight. "I'll draw their attention. You and Kaiser move toward the fence." Emma stepped out of cover and shined her flashlight toward the group, yelling, "Police! Drop your weapons!" The sudden burst of light and sound caused momentary confusion. Several figures shouted in alarm and began pursuing her, giving James and Kaiser a chance to slip away unnoticed. They sprinted toward the fence at the far end of the lot, Kaiser guiding the way. As they reached the perimeter, James spotted a weak section of the chain-link fence and pulled it back, allowing them to squeeze through. On the other side, flashing red and blue lights appeared in the distance. Backup had arrived. With the sound of sirens growing louder, their pursuers began retreating. Emma regrouped with James and Kaiser as officers flooded the area, securing the scene. "We did it," she said breathlessly, relief washing over her face. Kaiser stood tall beside them, his eyes still sharp and watchful. James placed a hand on the dog's head, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved us, buddy." The danger had passed, but the truth was clear. Whoever had been after Kaiser wasn't finished. As the officers secured the facility, James knew their fight for justice had only just begun. But tonight they had won, and Kaiser was finally safe.